Okay, welcome to the November 12th, 2024 meeting of the Ann Arbor Planning Commission. Let's see, this is our working session. The meeting is being recorded and will be available on the city's website for future viewing. However, as this is a working session, there will be no decisions made during this meeting. We're going to open with public comment. Is that correct?
Yes.
So thank you. I was just waiting. I don't have the agenda. I have the script. So I want to make sure that I'm doing the right
Do you
thing.
see
All right.
Sarah Hammerschmidt in the attendee list?
Yeah. All right. This is an opportunity for persons to speak to the Planning Commission for up to 3 minutes. To speak during this public hearing remotely, press *9 if listening by phone, or use the raised hand feature if viewing through the web link or Zoom. City staff will select callers that have raised their hand using the last 3 digits of their phone number or by name if available. For those accessing through Zoom, you will hear an automated announcement that the host is allowing you to speak. When speaking, please move to a quiet area and mute any television or background sounds so that you may be heard clearly. Please state your name and address at the beginning of your comments. Planning Manager Kelly, do we have any public commenters?
I do not see any hands raised.
I do not either. Right, seeing no public commenters, I will turn the meeting over to you to introduce our guests from the DDA. Is that okay?
Yes, that works for me. I would like to ask Jada Hallbrook, DDA Parking Manager, to go on video. Hi, Jada. Welcome to Planning Commission working session. And I've tried to promote your colleague several times. Ms. Mancini-Nichols, would you please accept promotion to panelist? And a note to the group that I'm also promoting, Commissioner Mills and Chair Lee.
Thank you.
You should have permission to share screen, Ms. Hallbrook. So I will let you proceed with your introduction after just mentioning briefly that the presentation this evening and the opportunity for question and answer came directly out of your commission proposed business. It's a response to your request to understand how generally curb space is considered during the development review process, and in particular for downtown and DDA district developments. So with that in mind, that's the genesis of the request for presentation, and I appreciate our guest availability this evening.
Sure, absolutely. So I believe I shared my screen. Would it help if I put it in full screen? Is everybody seeing that full screen presentation now? Okay, we'll do that. And work our way through. Thank you. So my name is Jada Hallbrook. I am the DDA parking manager, and thank you for having us here today. I'm joined by Chrissy Mancini-Nichols. She is the Director of Curb Management and New Mobility for Walker Consultants. Oh, sorry. So I'm going to tonight kind of move quickly through some high-level parking system information, why we wanted to engage with Walker in this process and some of our key findings, and then focus on how we're using the plan in real life, specifically with site plan review and kind of some other current efforts that are underway and next steps. So just some really high level information about the DDA. So we are one organization, one mission, but we talk about our work that we do as coming from 2 separate systems. So each of the systems is working toward a vibrant downtown, but this distinction can be important because each system has its own funding sources and budgets. So that's why we like to kind of upfront help people understand which system we're talking about. So tonight we're talking about the parking system. So there's an agreement between the city and the DDA that outlines roles and responsibilities related to parking. So parking facilities are city assets, but the DDA manages, operates, and maintains those assets. The parking system is self-sufficient, and parking revenues support other transportation initiatives. For example, the Go Pass, which is the free bus pass for downtown employees that some of you might be familiar with. Beyond that, as per the agreement, the city receives 20% of gross parking revenue, and the city manages enforcement and the residential parking programs and receives revenue from both of those. So just to talk a little bit about why we undertook this study. So as downtown Ann Arbor has evolved, so have the uses and intensity of activity at the curb. And in 2022, the DDA hired Walker Consultants to lead a curb management study, and we received the deliverables earlier this year. And Walker is a parking consulting firm with real expertise in this area, and in many ways, they're kind of leading the industry as well as communities to understand this important component of their downtowns. They've been doing a lot of work studying technologies at the curb, so we were really happy to have them lead this for us. So curb management is a catch-all term that defines a lot of activities at the curb: policies, strategies, practices, and technologies around the curb and managing that public right-of-way. And curb studies can have a range of scope based on community efforts and past efforts in the community and needs. And our parking curb study was funded by the parking system with a particular focus on vehicle access at the curb. And over the course of the study, we received feedback from the DDA board and committees, the Commission on Disability Issues, Transportation Commission, City of Ann Arbor Community Standards staff, the police department, and the Ann Arbor, the city DDA street design team. So even before the pandemic, we were really seeing shifts in needs and demand level at the curb, and consumer behavior following and during COVID kind of only intensified those shifts. We've also seen demand change based on land use changes. And, you know, in some areas, the curbs require more management than others. For example, areas near dense residential development, where delivery and loading needs are going to be different than in maybe perhaps a more standard commercial district. So we needed a comprehensive way to think about and plan for vehicle access at the curb. And that started with us understanding best practices. And many of the best practices around curb management are things that the DDA and the city have long recognized. For example, we understand the value and kind of the finite nature of curb space, and we've been pricing the curb and regulating the curb in an effort to drive people's behavior. We've also seen the curb as access for not only vehicles, but other forms of transportation and activity as well. So Walker helped us to articulate curb management and respond to these changing uses at the curb, and I think importantly to be ready for what's next. The study and the resulting plan include consideration for all of these various puzzle pieces that need to be in place for the curb to function well. So we can make prioritization decisions, but we also need to be sure we're operationalizing across agencies and departments. So for example, if we're contemplating a change at the curb, what can our existing equipment do? What might we need to invest in? What does that mean for enforcement staff, and what policies need to be in place? So this plan kind of helped us pull all of that together. as I mentioned, these studies can mean different things to different communities. And the good news is that we have really clear goals and plans already in place in Ann Arbor to help guide this work. And in many ways, I think we were ahead of where some other communities start. So this plan was meant to build upon all these existing plans and meant to complement current efforts like the downtown circulation study. So the circulation study is evaluating all the demands for limited street space, and this plan will help us direct how we slot in vehicle access, should that be all or some of the use on a particular block face or street segment. So this plan really builds on the momentum of all those other plans and establishes a holistic set of strategies to manage the curve. It recognizes that a balanced and really nuanced approach is important to meet the many needs of a downtown like ours. We want to be meeting vehicle access needs while also working towards other citywide goals, around things like active transportation, transit, safety, and climate. And we use those existing goals and priorities to kind of create our own set of guiding principles about how we think about curb use. So this is where you'll see some of those city plans reflected in our work. So the plan has 3 sections: the plan, a playbook, and an existing conditions report. It's a pretty hefty document, so I'm going to kind of highlight in this presentation areas from the plan that I think will be relevant to this commission's work. So a component of the plan was data collection. We installed cameras to collect curb use in 3 areas downtown. And what we quickly learned was that it was really tricky to find a time to collect this data that would represent normal activity. During the collection periods that we landed on, there were street closures on both Main Street and State Street because of construction. And as we all know, time of year and even home game versus away game can really impact downtown activity. So one lesson learned is that there's maybe not a normal, but maybe there's some generalizations that we can make about data. Following the collection of the data, it was analyzed using computer vision tools that work to pull out occupancy, vehicle type, and dwell time data points. So some of the kind of key high-level findings or short-term sessions make a significant number of stays at our curb. Utilization is high when meters are not enforced, so after 6 p.m., and a significant number of stays occur in no parking areas. So these are items that we probably all knew were happening, but the data really makes clear the intensity of these uses. I won't go through this in much detail here, but this is really meant to point out that every curve is unique. But the data helped us to make and kind of confirm use patterns based on typologies. Again, I'm not going to go into detail on this now, but later when we talk about site plan review, you'll see how this typology framework is helpful in our decision making. So findings for all 3 study areas are included in the full plan, but I'm focusing tonight on South University area since it is where we're seeing a lot of intense development and where I believe you've recently had some questions about loading activity. So the length of stay information really demonstrates that the 2-hour kind of traditional parking that this area has a lot of is just really not how people are using the curb. We need to consider a range of time limits on a block and continue our efforts to push those longer term vehicle storage stays to off-street parking facilities. So one note here is that when you see the label commercial in this data information, that means vehicles that the computer model could identify as commercial. So box trucks, semis, maybe trucks with logos, etc. This doesn't capture the commercial activity that's happening in that area that the computer reads as a personal vehicle. So perhaps we're missing that Uber Eats commercial activity in the evening because it's happening in someone's personal sedan. So given what we know the labels to mean, the data patterns really seem to kind of match our experiences. So if you look at this hour of day arrival based on type, you know, maybe this in the morning is the large, you know, Cisco or food and beer delivery trucks that we see downtown in the early morning. You know, as the day gets going, we're seeing some more UPS, FedEx, Amazon trucks arrive. And then, you know, the evening peak and personal vehicles, maybe that's, you know, ride share and meal delivery serving residences in the evening hours. So this graph shows legitimate activity, which is the activity in either a space or a loading zone, and activity recorded as violations, which is activity in a space that's not a space or a loading zone. So a driveway, curb cut, fire hydrant, crosswalk, that kind of activity. And here we added in a layer of meter transactions. So that green line is meter transactions where people actually paid for their parking. But this is more than about revenue. It's also, and maybe primarily, about management. I mean, we can see in this neighborhood, when our management of the curb ends, there's still significant use. So that's those big peaks, that high level of use after 6 p.m. So this image helps to visualize dwell times at the curb. This is South University between Church and Forest Streets. Remember, this data is from 2022, and we all know there's been significant changes in that area even since then. But this really demonstrates that people are using pretty much every available inch of curb for short-term stays. Whether it be a legitimate, you know, space or a fire hydrant. So using our best practices, the goals and the data, the plan really helped us organize our next steps into timeframes. And in a few slides, I'll walk through where we are with some of these and our next steps. But I want to shift gears a little bit, if I could, and talk about how we use the plan in site plan review. So there's two elements in the curb management plan that really help us put the plan into action: the guide and the playbook. And for the purposes of site plan review, it's really that guide that we look to. So Shelby Fergon is the DDA planning specialist, the staff member who participates in the site plan review process. When new site plans are submitted within the DDA boundary, she reviews certain elements of the public right-of-way. So this includes things like sidewalk width and materials, bike parking, trees and pits, lighting. She's also checking for curbside uses like parking and loading. And that curbside use review applies to projects within the DDA boundary and also within the larger parking area. And her reviews are informed by the street design manual, which is a part of the city standard specifications. And the street design manual includes all of the design standards and best practices for downtown streets and sidewalks. So requirements for those items that Shelby's reviewing for really vary depending on context. So blocks in the DDA are based on categories, are situated in categories based on their frontage context. So destination commercial, civic, etc. and also their prioritized method of transportation. For example, a sidewalk width in a destination commercial context will be wider than sidewalk width in a near neighborhood context. So when it comes to curbside uses like loading and parking, the street design manual mainly provides requirements for placement and layout of these spaces, which we have a snip on the side there from the street design manual. However, it doesn't require parking or loading, and it doesn't provide guidance for the appropriate ratio of parking to loading. It doesn't consider the spillover effects. So during the review process, a developer might propose a loading zone, or we may request them to add one, but we're using our judgment to decide, what makes sense based on the context. An important disclaimer to make here is that curbside area can be changed at any time by the DDA. Just because it's in the site plan doesn't mean it must remain that way. We want to preserve our and the city's ability to be flexible and make changes in the future. So I think that's where you see Shelby's note in site plans, some kind of standard language about that. But again, the curbside management plan really kind of fills in and is a supplement to the street design manual in providing some of this more detailed guidance on, ratios and spillover effects. So now when Shelby's reviewing the site plan, she uses this plan and, we consult, and we're making sure that we're making curbside changes kind of in understanding of the holistic impact of the changes. So as we think about allocation of curb space across a block, again, we're talking about the typologies and following the street design manual and the curb plan and deciding what typology the project fits in to. Also important to note that in addition to using this process for site plan review, we're also using this for public project planning and just ongoing operational work. So we've got the typologies, and then we've got the curb uses. So this menu pulls in the functions that we identified when we talked about existing study and plans that this work references. So again, this is where you'll see citywide goals for transportation, transit, etc., included in the discussion. And then this is the chart that really pulls it all together. It's not a formula, but just a really good guide. So we have our curb typologies across the top and items from our use menu or functions along the side. And when we're reviewing a site plan, many of these function decisions have already been made or are outside the scope of the project or even outside the scope of our authority as the parking manager. So we're really focusing in on that commercial support category and long-term parking category. And we, have a list of questions that we're sort of working through. What will this change in use or new development, what will the impacts be to loading? We're thinking about size, type, and timing of deliveries, what their dwell time will be. Do we need to match loading to a specific place in a building? Is there an access area? Is the developer building in some kind of logistics or mailroom sort of situation? What is the nearby parking location? Is there long-term parking nearby? What's the neighborhood context? And importantly, what are the spillover effects, to adjacent blocks? So based on all of this, Shelby's putting together her recommendation about configuration for that block and specifically that site plan. And then administratively, we're taking steps to get traffic control orders drafted so we're ready to implement whatever changes need to be made when the project is complete. And I added this map in. So this is a map of loading zones, and this GIS layer is actually the sign layer. So you'll see loading zones represented as a pair of dots. Because loading is reviewed as part of site plans and also as part of larger public projects, many loading zones have been added or relocated in the last few years. Some good recent examples would be like really thorough discussions with the Carytown neighborhood, with the State Street neighborhood, as the city and DDA have had street reconstruction projects in those areas. Lastly, I want to just share a few updates on items from the playbook that we're making progress on. The playbook is that document that has immediate, near, and long-term recommendations based on kind of 5 categories that are listed here. 2 that we've made progress on are the ADA spaces standard and monetizing pricing. So Walker helped us to understand proposed standards for on-street ADA parking spaces. The standards would have 2 elements, quality and design, both of which, if the standards are approved, would be mandatory for newly installed or substantially reconstructed streets. But we're looking to get ahead of these elements, where we're able to. The quantity standard calls for 1 ADA space for every 25 paid parking spaces on a block perimeter. So this fall, we have evaluated all the block perimeters and are adding, by the end of this year, around 48 ADA spaces, with a few more to follow next year as projects wrap up and construction zones are pulled back. There's lots to consider when we're thinking about placement. Our sidewalks and right-of-ways have many components managed by multiple departments. So I've included here kind of a list of what we were considering as we thought about placement on a block. The design standard addresses space size, obstructions, and travel paths. While we are not currently underway with a big street reconstruction project, we're taking advantage of some planned right-of-way work on 4th Ave in the block of 100 North 4th to design and install an accessible space. And we're learning a lot through that process about where this is even feasible, what we need to think about and plan for as far as moving, underground infrastructure, grading, and things like that. So this is going to be an ongoing process, but it's one of the items that we're moving on right away. Another piece of this that we made progress on as far as pricing at the curb, we did a rate study in 2023, and earlier this year, our board approved a 3-year rate plan. We are actively working with our enforcement staff at the city to understand how we can best implement and enforce shorter time limit spaces to move away from 2-hour spaces to meeting some of the short-term parking needs. And enforcement hours comes up every few years or so in this city. The curb study recommends updating those hours to align with demand. And just to kind of let you know where we're headed, some of our next steps, we are working with the other part of the DDA staff on wayfinding updates. We're working to kind of maintain our curb inventory database in a more formal way. We continue to work with enforcement around developing strategies for them, and we'll continue to watch what other cities are doing about smart loading zones and charging in loading zones and all of that, kind of next step that some cities are already underway with. So this is kind of where we're headed, items that we've tagged as maybe next in line. So, pardon me, I've included links here to the curb management plan on the DDA website. and also the DDA website page that talks about the circulation study. And I've included my information should anybody have questions or want additional information. But now I think Chrissy and I are happy to answer any questions you may have about what we presented.
All right, thank you so much for the presentation. And now we are ready for discussion. Would
Mr.
any
Weiss, I think that Chair Lee is with us now. Is your
Oh, I just saw his phone, so I wasn't sure if he was doing anything, but I will yield to the chair. You're muted. You're not coming through at all. I see your phone in your hand. Do you need to be moved over? Okay, as a panelist.
It is being done.
Thank you. Right.
You
You
may
have
want to
to
mute
turn-
your computer.
Turn off the volume on your computer.
I'm just gonna leave on my computer. I'm so sorry. I updated my laptop and my audio isn't working with Zoom. So that was a little bit of charades. Thank you for, I didn't know how to say promote. So I was like, that was kind of.
And you just muted yourself again.
Sick. You would think that after 4 years of Zoom, I would have this down pat. So again, my apologies. Thank you again for an awesome presentation. Very, very helpful to kind of learn through the standards that the DDA applies. But with that, I think we'll have an informal discussion, kind of a Q&A session. So I'll open the floor. No need to keep kind of like decorum. Just unmute yourself and ask questions as necessary. Thanks. Anybody want to kick us off?
I'm never reticent to jump in. I have a question. I'm curious about the revenues that you raised through the parking, and if I followed the presentation correctly, you're making sufficient revenues to cover the cost of providing those parking services. So are you looking to change the pricing structure just to make more revenues, or because you're trying to make up for a shortfall, or what's the motivation behind changing the hours and increasing rates and that kind of stuff?
Sure. So like I mentioned, the DDA conducted a rate study last year. We looked long-term at all of our expenses across the system, and actually on-street meters, as you would guess, are not that costly to manage. It's the large, 40+ year structures that cost much more as far as maintenance. But what we did was raise rates across the system, on-street and off-street, hourly and permits, to meet our financial obligations. We are not doing it just to make revenue. We're meeting kind of our financial obligations that allow us to continue to provide 20% to the city, to keep the facilities maintained, etc. Specifically on street, over many years, we have worked to kind of create a differential between parking on street and in the structures in an effort to drive those longer term stays to off street lots or parking structures. And as far as extending enforcement hours, like I said, that's been something that comes up in our community kind of every few years or so. It was a recommendation of the curb study to change those hours, not for revenue purposes, but to really match the demand and the use that we're seeing. We see such intense uses and activity downtown after 6 p.m. when we basically are kind of walking away from our curve as far as enforcement. So that's where that recommendation was coming from.
And Jada, I'll just add, like Jada showed, we saw this huge uptick in demand after enforcement's over. And, while revenue, as you move away from more parking spaces and try to add loading zones and bike lanes and, all the other things that would replace parking, You're just also unable to manage demand if it's not priced when, there's still a significant amount of utilization, after 6 p.m., especially with all the nightlife downtown, and, that's only growing. So, it's really about demand management, and pricing is the best way to manage parking demand, and also encourage people not to drive and, use other modes. So, that was one of the key reasons why we recommended extending the enforcement hours.
Thank you. Sarah.
Thanks. I'm gonna summarize what I think I heard and then to ask a question. So what I think I heard is your studies have effectively found the same thing that we're seeing, like experiencing as cyclists or drivers in town, like illegal parking, right, in places where it shouldn't be. And I mean, that's the thing I think that comes up a lot, delivery trucks or whatever in a place where we didn't anticipate it. And it seems like there's a number of strategies that go into like addressing that. I also heard, which this was, I think, the first that I knew about this, the DDA's review of site plans in this area. And I guess what I couldn't 100%, like, I don't know how long that's happened and or how the things that the study picked up, how long it has been that those considerations of like, where is the package room? Where is the like entry? How long it's been that those have been adapted? So that's question number one. But then it's really to like ask question number two, which is, are there things that from your perspective, like, I mean, we ask some of these same questions because we're not sure if that's our responsibility. Like, how are the packages going to work? How can you tell us that there's not going to be an Uber truck or an Amazon truck, in the bike lane where there's no curb cut there? Is there anything that you think would make, like, I guess question number two is, should we keep doing that? Like, is that helpful? Or do you guys have it? And I guess number three is there anything that you think needs to change in the zoning? I know that like zoning is not what happens in the right of way, but instead what happens in the building, thinking about entrances, thinking about requiring curb cuts that, or I mean, not curb cuts, but like a clear place where we know that Amazon driver can park off-site, or the Uber cars and DoorDashes can come, that would be better. So
Sure.
the history of the site plan review, whether we should keep asking, and maybe how zoning should change.
Sure. So I can answer two of those. So the history, before Shelby was doing this process for us, my colleague Amber Miller was doing this, and I believe she's been doing this for a while. I think what may have changed recently, and we have been all along kind of looking at these same elements. I think what has changed is maybe, the type of development that we're seeing in the South University area and just the intensity of activity that that's bringing. Recently she and I were talking about some development projects on 4th Ave and even kind of understanding how those are different than, what we're seeing on South University. So I think we have been part of this review process for a while, and we have been thinking about those things. It's just maybe the intensity of uses with certain types of development that really bring this to the forefront. And I think you should absolutely keep asking those those questions because it's helpful to kind of suss out how they're thinking about these things. The question that I'm not comfortable is answering is the zoning question. I'm a parking person. I'm not a planner or a zoning expert by any means. So I would hate to weigh in on that when that's just not really my field of expertise.
And sorry, I was gonna add, Commissioners, so just to kind of frame this, we're working in cities large and small. This week, so I'm in Atlanta right now trying to figure out the same thing. Loading and delivery is an issue no matter the city size, and it is challenging to deal with right now because there's a lot of technology out there. We're working with the city of Minneapolis, for example, right now on us. We have a smart grant to install all these like high-tech fancy cameras and see if we can get the cameras to enforce loading zones. I mean, and the technology is in its very infancy. Maybe it will pan out that that's an option. We're engaging with all the freight companies, and they know this is a problem. We've done some ride-alongs with delivery trucks, and they're just like, we just need more space. But it's a challenge everywhere because we know, like on South University, on Forest, like those dense buildings have a lot of intensity with loading. But I think the Landmark Towers has a loading off-street loading dock, or there was at least that garage where drivers could pull into, and drivers probably don't want to because it's not at the door. But even still, if you create that loading zone, what we found is, people are just parking their cars there because people are also going to pick up their juice or their, dinner, and they just think, well, I can park for 5 minutes in the loading zone, no one's going to catch me. So it's part of a whole issue around enforcing creating more zones, enforcing them. Because unless you enforce them, like I'll see drivers that will park in the turning lane because they don't want to park at the curb, even if there's space, because they think they're going to get blocked in. So unless there's like a real enforcement strategy, and this is a problem everywhere, not just in Arbor, then, that's really what's going to help move the needle.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments? Julie.
Yeah, so I just had a couple, and this is something that I think about a lot, and I think you touched on it some with talking about equipment and talking about like the difficulty of knowing exactly what happens on streets because they're closed for construction or they're doing. So for me, two things. So one is how are closed streets kind of figured into all of this, especially with accessibility and we close Main Street and some of Liberty in the summers, how we've picked some certain dates as being summer, but I think those dates are changing, and it's a perfectly lovely day out today and it's middle of November, and we like how we manage sort of closed streets with all sorts of things. And also for us, similar to Minneapolis, is snow and ice. How do we make sure that we create these zones, we create these areas for parking or for pedestrians or for bikes, but then we don't actually manage them for the weather conditions or the closed streets? Like how do those fit into kind of the thoughts? Because I looked through the presentation, and there wasn't any mention of like winter maintenance, but I know you did talk about certain equipment and stuff, so I assume that it's there. but how do those, like, when we make sort of temporary changes to the whole system, how do we accommodate that in our plans?
Sure. So, to your first point about closed streets, so when I mentioned them, I was really kind of referencing that, when we said to Chrissy, like, okay, we're going to pick some normal weeks for you to monitor. And then we discovered that's really hard to do for a lot of reasons. And a lot of those reasons are really great reasons because there's busy or we're improving things. But it's the circulation study. It's a joint study with the DDA and the city transportation department. And that study is really looking at a few key things, one of which is street closures, either permanent or seasonal. and how they impact, you know, not just access, but kind of traffic flow throughout downtown. So I think that study will be the place to look for some of those answers. And to your question about how we, you know, after we create these zones or areas, how we make sure they're accessible across all parts of the year and so on. That's one piece where we really need to be coordinated with other departments and agencies. So, you know, I'm looking at it through, you know, a parking lens. But we also have like City Public Works that's looking at whatever is being created on the street through, you know, their lens with snow maintenance and so on. Where I'm interfacing most with other departments is with city enforcement staff, because a lot of those other decisions about use and function, like bike lane, closed street, etc., are kind of made somewhere else. Where I'm mostly interfacing with other city agent or departments is around enforcement. If we were to add 15-minute spaces, what does that enforcement look like on your end? What tools would you need? What's the best technology to help us get to that place? So I think there are people thinking about those things, but for the purpose of this particular study, it was if it's determined that we have some vehicle access in this block or street segment, how are we kind of allocating that?
Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Can I ask a question? Just maybe this is off topic, but I'm curious if you were involved in the State Street improvements that took out the curbless, that have curbless sidewalks now. And has that been a success from the city's perspective? And are there plans to do more of that elsewhere? Or is that just completely aside from what you're talking about here?
It's sort of completely aside, but I do know a little bit. I think I can speak to it a little bit. So I definitely think that it, at least from some perspectives, would be called a success. I know that our annual like big downpour during art fair, the streets did not flood there where they used to flood pretty frequently during events like that. So I think that's a success story. As we've been thinking about accessible spaces at the curbless street, you know, certainly takes that, makes that a whole heck of a lot easier, because, you know, then we're just thinking about, you know, street furniture, trash can placement, things like that. We already have kind of like the travel path problem, you know, solved for. So I think in a lot of ways, that has been successful. And I don't want to speak on behalf of my colleagues, but I would assume that as there's big street projects coming up, that design will certainly be a consideration. And Christy, I don't know if you can speak to how much you're seeing that kind of design in other cities.
Yeah, definitely other cities are looking at the curbless because it just adds, like Judy say, it makes things so much more flexible, you know, as you want to put a parklet in or, you know, change regulations or, you know, have accessible spaces. It just makes it much more easier to make those changes to the curb without having to go and take the curb out or put in more concrete, which can get very expensive.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for indulging my question.
All right. Any other thoughts, comments? I'm also happy to jump in here. On the long term, I had a quick question. I saw EV charging as a curb kind of potential, but that could also have a drawback of people staying there for a much longer period of time. And that kind of like readiness would probably take a little bit more infrastructure planning from delivery of power panels, conduits, etc. So to what extent has there been any kind of planning from like the City of Ann Arbor side or the DDA for implementation of something like that?
Sure. So that was something that we wanted noted in the plan, just so it's something that we didn't lose track of.
Yeah.
Our planning around EV charging in the parking system is we worked with the city a few years ago now and have installed 80 chargers, 80 ports in parking structures and garages. And
Mhm.
right now that those locations seem to be meeting the demand that's out there. And for now, we think that's kind of the best place to have the EV charging happening and use the curb space for all the other things that, you know, we think are important there. I do know that the city sustainability office has implemented some on-street parking EV charging, but I believe it's outside of the downtown area. And in like I think more neighborhood context. So I think we're kind of planning for that downtown, and we want to be ready and thinking about it if we ever decide that structures or lots is not where that should be. And then I think separately, the city is thinking about on-street charging in other neighborhoods.
Got it. Thank you. And then I'll put a strange little plug. I spent about 3 weeks in South Korea and saw some interesting curb utilizations. They actually have LED lights at the base of kind of crosswalks that are red when it's red, and then green when the pedestrians are supposed to walk. And what it does is it provides like very clear legibility of like pedestrian area versus auto-centric. And there's also large umbrellas at each of those cross sections to provide shade as well as some insulation. But I'll send over some pictures. It was just an interesting kind of international kind of case study of how it might look like. And so, but I just wanted to put that little plug in for how we could create even more legibility on the curb management side from design of curbs in that respect. But thank you again for the presentation. Any other commissioners with thoughts, comments with respect to this particular presentation? Donnell.
And you may have answered this already. I'm sorry if I didn't track it. It's really about the violations. I know that the city does enforcement, but the thing I think we see most when we're at the table, especially in the corridor that you noted that there's like all of the spaces being used, is it does create a pedestrian hazard in that space. And I wonder where you see in maybe if there's a triangle of planning, the city and the DDA, where we can find a happy medium around trying to resolve some of either the double parking, the U-turns that occur in that tight space, or whether the DDA has looked at the space and maybe suggested to the city that we should close it to vehicular traffic. Like, I know you're in the parking specific aspect of that, but I'm just trying to figure out like how we should be thinking about that, because I know we have some tools inside the zoning document. But if you are already imagining, like you did, like on Division and Fifth, with putting in the bike lanes and then removing parking and then returning those to two-way traffic, like if those things are already on the horizon as we think about these spaces to increase pedestrian safety, it would be helpful to get some insight on that. But if that's out of scope, that's fine as well. It was just a note that I had a question in my notes.
Yeah, so I think that is, those are things that we're kind of constantly thinking about, and especially understanding spillover effects. If we make a choice, for one block, what does that mean? Hopefully, if we make a choice for a block to put in a bike lane and it's designed so that vehicles can't get in there, and park illegally, like, then where do we want them to go? Just being realistic with, businesses will need delivery, people will need to get to locations. So kind of thinking not just site specific or block specific, but kind of thinking about that larger neighborhood context. And where we have really started to work with the city enforcement is, what tools they have available to help us enforce some of those things that you're seeing, like double parking or people overstaying in loading zones. And one thing that I've really become keenly aware of is that parking enforcement staff have a lot of responsibility. So I call them parking enforcement staff, but actually they're community standard staff, and they are responsible for code enforcement across the city. So while we may feel it's a priority for them to really focus on like loading zones or bike lanes, they're also enforcing, like the leaf blower ordinance or, sidewalk snow clearing ordinance. So we've been trying to understand kind of what abilities and what kind of time they can devote to certain things based on their what resources they have available to them currently. And of course, advocating, and being a good partner to them and helping them with tools and technology and, policies that make their job easier. But they do have a lot of items kind of citywide that they're responsible for enforcing. And it was, as I've been in, closer communication with them, that was a really important reminder.
So
So
a
we'll
quick
continue.
follow-up.
Mhm.
The Galleria development that's coming, when they came to the table, I think I asked whether or not they were going to have a delivery zone. And I think if I'm remembering correctly, and there's a record, so I could be wrong, they indicated that they wanted to take out the paid parking right in front of the building, but they had some obstacles with that with the DDA. Does that jive with what you understand? Would you say, yes, that's true, or no, they didn't ask that? Because I think that's where the intersection is, because we see the development, we know what's going to happen there. So then we ask the developer, hey, can you take this out so that you have a loading, unloading zone? Because you're going to have so many things, Amazon packages, you've got Uber Eats, you've got all those other kinds of delivery services that are coming. And if they have a space to go, that's safer for pedestrian and bike traffic. And then the developer will say to us, well, we can't touch the street because the DDA owns the street. We're happy to solve that problem, but we are prohibited. So I think that's how it got on our work plan. That's how we got here today, so that we could, one, stay in our own lane of like what's in our purview and then what's in yours. But we also need to understand, like, is the issue a finance issue? So if you take out 4 parking spots, you're looking at revenue that's in your budget. You don't want to lose that. So instead of asking for a park contribution, we ask the developer to replace that revenue in perpetuity. So like, how do we think about it? Because there are human lives that are in the crosshairs here. So that's really what we're trying to solve, or at least what I'm trying to solve, is someone doesn't get doored because they're on a bike. A pedestrian doesn't get hit because someone's doing an illegal U-turn, or some other tragedy that would have that kind of interaction in the street.
Sure, and I do believe that that's what was said in the meeting where that plan was discussed. I was not involved in that meeting or that site plan review in a too detailed of a way, but I believe there was some confusion about what was actually asked of the DDA. We don't ever make those kind of decisions based on revenue. I mean, it's just, we are always working in support of all the city goals and plans, whether that's, the transportation plan, the non-motorized plan, Vision Zero. So I believe after some back and forth with that developer, and, again, I was not the person directly involved in this, that it was not presented, that maybe that specific question had not been asked to us, because that's certainly something that we're thinking about. And if it makes sense for that development, for the community, for users, for the safety of other users, we're certainly going to make that change and not make that decision based on revenue. I mean, I think the only revenue component at the curb is more like the long-term revenue component. If we're taking away paid parking spaces, are we shifting that cost to someone else? Or are we okay just losing that revenue, which maybe that's the answer, but definitely in the short and medium term, we're always going to be making decisions based on what's best for the neighborhood and the safety of all the users.
So just another follow-up. So it would be okay for us, doing a lot of work there. At the planning table, if we're not, well, I guess by the time it comes to us, we are making a final decision. So I guess maybe this question is to planning manager Kelly. So could we, from what we understand in this conversation, ask the developer to go back to the DDA to address the concerns that the planning commission would have about loading and unloading in front of their building? It sounds like that would be a friendly conversation, but we have no enforcement tool, if I'm understanding everything correctly. So it's not in the code. So we can't say you're out of compliance with this, so we won't move this forward, but we can ask.
So a couple of things that are on my mind. The first is that there is a review by the DDA. There's also a review by engineering and transportation steps. You have a three-pronged transportation review over multiple review periods. And when staff who are looking at this day in and day out across multiple projects have a concern, they're pretty good at escalating it. So they will put into their memos, into their reviews directly on the site plan, etc., concerns that they have that they would like to be addressed. And when those may not have been fully addressed in the period of time before it comes to the planning commission table, and it's serious enough, we usually preemptively offer a conditional approval, or will bring up in the staff report under the other department reviews that this was an outstanding issue that could not be resolved. So the concerns that may arise from the planning commission about a given site plan, I'd rather not pick on a particular address, but what is available to the planning commission to request of a developer at that point. It should be something that is based in a requirement in the UDC is the answer. Is that if you do not want to approve a plan, there should be a regulatory reason for that. Or if it is a planned unit development tied somehow into on a lack of fulfillment of the beneficial effects, or like failure to meet the benefits to the city somehow. So I would say, if you would like to look through some examples, or raise some specific concerns maybe to an upcoming meeting around what areas of the UDC could relate to those concerns, for a no vote, for example, could talk about that. Is that helpful? I'm just trying to.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'm hearing, and just quickly what I'm processing is there are multiple people who look at this, but there's not a single person who is the arbiter of sort of this specific thing that we are seeing at the table, because we're dealing with a lot of these high-rise student dwellings in these tight spaces, because it's really in those tight spaces that we are most concerned. We're going to see this come back when Five Corners has already been approved, but that was something that we talked to Five Corners about, and they changed their site plan where they had sort of a cut into the road so that the delivery trucks could be there, the bike traffic could go, but it wouldn't impede pedestrian safety. This was, the Galleria is a by right development, so they were already approved to do everything that they wanted to do, so we wouldn't have been able to, by statute, prevent them from doing that inside the UDC. So it's just sort of like, but it's still a problem. And I think what I might be like, my conclusion for this is it's still a problem, but it's not any single person's responsibility. And because of that, you have to get all these things to align, right? You got to get engineering, the DDA, traffic to align and say, we all agree this is a problem. So together we're going to solve this problem. But each of those individual entities are looking at it through their own lens, and they may not see the problem that we see at the table, but we don't have a regulatory tool to resolve it. And so it sounds like we continue to ask developers, or we continue to ask staff, but there's not a clear path because it's in the jurisdiction of all these other entities. So I think that what you answered is helpful, but that would be my conclusion from what you answered.
I think where we are seeing the primary intensity of new development does map very closely to the current DDA boundary. I will also bring up, just for the good of the order, that there are discussions as part of the comprehensive plan to have a parallel conversation about potential adjustments to the DDA boundaries in the coming years, as we are thinking about how the future land use map will develop. So we are including the DDA not only on reviews right now that are inside of their current boundaries, we are also including them in high intensity developments that are in and around that border, on purpose, because even though maybe the downtown street design guidelines they have a different effect when you are requesting them outside of the downtown and thinking about there's different funding structures and so forth for different infrastructure. You still have that lens that this may, it's not inconceivable that this will become the downtown in some of the cases of these developments. So we are bringing the DDA to the table. I would say the people who are trying to merge all of those disparate angles of, bikes, deliveries, parking, accessibility, in this case, it is the DTA, which is why they've been doing these studies, is to try to bring all of those concerns, channel them, and put action items to them. In the case of the circulation study, it is joint, as Jada mentioned, with the city. And I think that some of what folks are interested in this meeting are maybe more closely aligned with what the goals of the circulation study is, which is still underway. And it's linked at the end of the slides that are included in your packet. Jada, do you have information on what remaining opportunities there are to plug into that, or places to go for more information?
So the link on my last slide is to the website, the page on the DDA website where previous presentations are linked, as well as upcoming engagement opportunities. I'll speak with my colleague Amber tomorrow and just kind of see if I can get a little bit more detail to share with this group about maybe upcoming engagement opportunities. I don't know off the top of my head, but that link will kind of get you to their landing page, and I'll see what I can find out tomorrow.
And to the other point of the burden on current community standards staff, I think that is an ongoing conversation that we have across different areas of the city about resource planning. It is a challenge, especially when we have such a successful, downtown and very ambitious city goals, is trying to figure out that allocation of resources. It's very difficult.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments? Okay. With that, thank you so much for coming to present on this topic. We really appreciate your time. So with that, we're going to move on to the next portion of this working session, which is going to be public comment. So persons may speak for 3 minutes about any items, and please state your name and address for the record. Do we have any callers?
There was a hand raised and it lowered. Maybe we can just wait 1 second to see if that attendee did raise their hand again. Just 1 moment. And I will unmute. Jeff, you have permission to address Planning Commission for 3 minutes.
Oh, thank you very much. I live at 506 East Kingsley, which is downtown, and I'm very interested in this presentation about downtown circulation. And I have a couple concerns and interests. One of them is pedestrian safety. And what started this for me was walking my dog in the downtown and having bicyclists sort of come by very close and nearly hitting my dog. So I posted this on Nextdoor about pedestrian safety and bicycle safety and got like 300 responses. And so as it turns out, there are a number of very confusing intersections in the downtown that people bring up. And I'm hoping that in terms of pedestrian safety, someone, and I'm not sure exactly, I don't think it may not be the Planning Commission, but I'm trying to find out who can help with this to try to have sort of a citizen session where people can sort of point out very confusing situations in terms of right of way between bikers and car drivers and then bicyclists and pedestrians. There's a lot of confusing issues with the bike lanes, and I'm hoping that someone can help me figure out how to get some city agency involved in this. And the other thing is traffic congestion. If you ever try to go south on State Street at most times of the day, during the day, you're going to have a problem because there are a lot of buses that come down that street, and they've resurfaced. State Street has been completely redesigned. But what happens is you get stuck and you can't, as you proceed south, there are buses. But the trouble is you approach intersections, you can't turn because students are going across the street. So you end up being behind cars for quite a long period of time. There are other situations like coming up Main Street at certain times of the day. And I'm hoping that the DDA could do a traffic study to determine what areas currently have a lot of congestion and a lot of problems. I mean, it does no good for 820 if you have a lot of cars parked or lined up with their engines idling because the traffic is stuck. So I guess traffic congestion and pedestrian safety are two issues that I'm looking for help on. That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you. All right. Do we have any other public callers?
We do not. And if you would allow me, Mr. Chair, I'd just like to mention for the speaker that just called that there is a transportation commission for the city of Ann Arbor, which you are our liaison to, which more closely addresses issues of transportation, including safety, like conflicts between bicyclists, pedestrians, transit, including loading zones, etc. And this commission meets next on November 20th at 7 p.m. The agendas are and the meeting information is available through the city's Legistar page, as are these planning commission meetings, and you can reach out directly to the transportation team, which is within the city's engineering department, by emailing engineering@a2gov.org.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay. With that, if we have no other public callers, I think this particular working session, the next section is adjournment. Do I have a motion? Donald, do I have a second? Sarah, all those in favor or any opposed? Seeing none. Thank you, everybody. Have a great night.